Tonight, as the modern world begins to fade from your eyes, we'll step into the strange and sometimes disturbing world of how women throughout history have dealt with anxiety and nervous disorders. From Victorian hysteria's diagnoses to ancient Egypt's exotic prescriptions, we'll explore the treatments developed to address what may be one of history's most misunderstood emotional conditions. Dim your lights, find that perfect, comfortable position, and join me on a journey through the bizarre historical attempts to understand the deepest secrets of the female mind. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself in ancient Egypt around 1900 BCE. The air is warm, filled with the scent of lotus blossoms and incense. In a quiet chamber within a physician's house, a woman sits with downcast eyes, describing symptoms that would sound remarkably familiar to modern ears: racing thoughts, sleeplessness, feelings of suffocation, inexplicable fears. The Egyptian doctor, trained in the tradition of ancient medical papyri, listens carefully before making his diagnosis. Her womb has become displaced and is wandering through her body. This concept, the wandering womb, would persist for thousands of years as an explanation for female anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. The Egyptians believed that the uterus was an autonomous entity, capable of moving freely throughout a woman's body. When it traveled upward, it could press against the heart or lungs, causing what we might now recognize as panic attacks or anxiety. When it moved elsewhere, it might create other symptoms: fatigue, melancholy, irritability, or what ancient texts often described as suffocation of the mother. The treatment for this condition in ancient Egypt was as fascinating as the diagnosis itself. Physicians would attempt to lure the wandering womb back to its proper place through fumigation, placing aromatic substances near the vagina that the womb would find pleasant, while simultaneously placing foul-smelling substances near the nose to repel the womb downward. Sweet-smelling resins, honey, and fragrant oils were used below, while pungent, burnt materials were wafted under the nostrils. In some cases, women would be instructed to sit over a pot of heated aromatic herbs, allowing the steam to enter the body and guide the womb back to its rightful position. These fumigation treatments would often be accompanied by incantations, prayers to Isis or other goddesses associated with fertility and women's health, and the application of amulets or talismans believed to pacify the restless uterus. Egyptian women suffering from what we might now call anxiety were also prescribed special concoctions of herbs, minerals, and animal products. One recipe from the Kahun Papyrus, one of our oldest sources of ancient Egyptian medical knowledge, describes a mixture of frankincense, cumin, goose fat, and sweet beer to be consumed for 6 days to settle emotional disturbances. Other treatments involved the application of heated stones to specific parts of the body, cold baths at precise times of day, or the wearing of specific colors thought to calm the nerves and restore internal harmony. As the centuries passed and Greek civilization rose to prominence, these Egyptian concepts of women's mental health were adopted and expanded upon. Hippocrates, often called the father of Western medicine, embraced the theory of the wandering womb, writing extensively about hysteria, a term derived from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Imagine now that you're in ancient Greece, around 400 BCE. The bright Mediterranean sun illuminates the white stone of a physician's house in Athens. Here, a woman of good family sits nervously as Hippocrates himself examines her. She has been experiencing palpitations, difficulty breathing, a sensation of choking, and what her husband describes as excessive emotionality. Hippocrates' diagnosis would be familiar to his Egyptian predecessors. Her womb has become dry and light, allowing it to float upward in her body, pressing against her diaphragm, and causing these troubling symptoms. Hippocrates' treatment, however, would introduce new elements. He might prescribe marriage for a young unmarried woman, believing that sexual intercourse would moisten the womb and help anchor it in place through regular irrigation with male seed. For married women, pregnancy was often recommended as the ultimate solution, as a growing fetus would surely keep the womb properly positioned. For immediate relief, Greek physicians developed an array of aromatic therapies, herbal mixtures, and physical interventions. A common treatment involved having the patient sit over a cauldron of boiling herbs, with a funnel directing the steam toward the vagina. The warmth and moisture were thought to draw the wandering womb back downward. Cold water baths, specific diets, and moderate exercise were also prescribed to restore balance to the body's humors, the four vital fluids whose proper balance was believed essential to physical and mental health. The Greek approach to women's anxiety also introduced more systematic physical manipulations. Massage of the lower abdomen was performed to physically guide the womb back to its proper location. In some cases, pessaries, objects inserted into the vagina, might be used, created from wool soaked in soothing medicaments, or shaped from more solid materials like wood or stone. These were believed to help reposition the wandering organ. As night falls on our imaginary journey through time, let's move forward a few centuries to ancient Rome, where Greek medical knowledge was adopted but often modified with a practical Roman sensibility. The Romans maintained the concept of hysteria, but began to associate it more explicitly with sexual dissatisfaction or abstinence. A woman experiencing anxiety might be examined by a physician like Galen or Soranus, who would inquire carefully about her marital relations. Roman physicians developed elaborate classifications of anxiety symptoms in women, with different treatments prescribed depending on whether the woman was virginal, married, widowed, or elderly. Young unmarried women showing signs of nervousness, insomnia, or emotional outbursts might be urged toward prompt marriage. Widows were sometimes advised to remarry, while elderly women might be prescribed warm, moistening foods and special herbal concoctions to counteract the natural drying of aging bodies. Physical therapies became more sophisticated during this period. Roman bathhouses provided settings for hydrotherapy, with specific temperatures and mineral contents prescribed for different nervous conditions. Massage became more elaborate, with detailed instructions for manipulating different parts of the body to restore calm. Music therapy was employed, with certain modes and rhythms believed to soothe the disturbed female mind. The Romans also expanded the pharmacopoeia for treating women's anxiety, drawing on ingredients from throughout their vast empire. Valerian root, chamomile, lavender, and passion flower, herbs still used today for their calming properties, appear in ancient Roman medical texts. These might be prepared as teas, tinctures, or added to bath water. More exotic ingredients included castoreum, a secretion from beaver glands, ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, and various animal parts believed to influence the womb's behavior. As the Roman Empire eventually gave way to the Middle Ages, medical knowledge about women's mental health took a new and often darker turn. The influence of the Church began to color interpretations of female anxiety and emotional distress. In the dim halls of medieval monasteries, where much medical knowledge was preserved and practiced, women's hysteria began to take on spiritual and sometimes supernatural dimensions. Imagine a chilly stone chamber in a 12th century European monastery. A noble woman has been brought here, suffering from what her family describes as fits of weeping, terrible fears, and occasional violent outbursts. The monk physician who examines her must consider not only her physical condition, but the state of her soul. Is this a medical ailment, a spiritual crisis, or perhaps even demonic influence? Medieval treatments for women's anxiety often blended medical approaches inherited from antiquity with religious practices. Prayer, confession, and penance might be prescribed alongside herbal remedies and physical therapies. Pilgrimages to holy sites associated with female saints were recommended for particularly stubborn cases. Special amulets bearing saints' images or biblical verses might be worn to ward off both medical and spiritual distress. The medical theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile dominated medieval understanding of mental health. Women suffering from anxiety might be diagnosed with an excess of black bile, creating melancholy, or perhaps too much yellow bile, causing irritability and fearfulness. Treatments aim to restore humoral balance through diet, herbal medicines, and sometimes bloodletting or purging. Certain foods were prescribed or forbidden based on their supposed effects on women's emotions. Cold, dry foods were thought to exacerbate melancholy, while warm, moist foods might relieve it. Wine might be prescribed in moderation for its warming properties, but excessive consumption was warned against for its potential to inflame the passions. Specific herbs were cultivated in monastery gardens, specifically for treating women's nervous complaints, including Melissa lemon balm, Hypericum St. John's wort, and Rosa rose, whose petals and hips were used in calming preparations. Physical activity was carefully regulated for anxious medieval women. Too much exertion was believed dangerous, potentially stirring up the humors, while too little might allow melancholy to stagnate and deepen. Gentle walks in pleasant gardens, specific forms of needlework, and certain types of music were recommended as appropriately calming activities for noble women. For women of lower classes, different standards applied. Physical labor itself was often considered therapeutic, provided it was of the right kind and intensity. As the stars wheel overhead on our journey through time, let's move forward to the Renaissance, where medical knowledge began to expand rapidly, though not always in ways that benefited women's mental health treatment. In the 15th and 16th centuries, new anatomical knowledge from dissections was beginning to challenge ancient concepts like the wandering womb, yet many traditional treatments persisted. Picture a well-appointed chamber in a 16th century Italian palazzo. A physician educated at the University of Padua, one of Europe's most advanced medical schools, attends to a noble woman suffering from what we would now recognize as anxiety. His examination is more systematic than his medieval predecessors, noting pulse, complexion, patterns of sleep, and appetite. Yet his diagnosis might still invoke concepts of hysteria, and his treatments would blend the old with the new. Renaissance physicians began to pay more attention to what they called the passions of the soul, emotions, and their effects on physical health. Women's anxiety might be attributed to excessive love, grief, fear, or other strong emotions that needed to be counterbalanced. Music therapy became more sophisticated, with specific musical modes prescribed for different emotional states. Art, poetry, and exposure to beauty were incorporated into treatment regimens for wealthy patients, reflecting the Renaissance belief in harmony and proportion as keys to health. Gardens designed specifically for health began to feature in elite medical care, with certain plants chosen not just for their medicinal properties, but for their aesthetic and sensory qualities. Walking paths were laid out to provide the right amount of exercise, and seating arranged to catch refreshing breezes or pleasant views that might calm a troubled mind. Water features, fountains, small streams, reflecting pools, were incorporated for their soothing sounds and associations with purification. The expanding global trade networks of the Renaissance period introduced new medicinal substances from distant lands. Women's anxiety might now be treated with exotic preparations containing ingredients from the Americas, Africa, or Asia. Cacao from Mexico, various spices from India, or gums and resins from tropical forests. These substances were often fantastically expensive, available only to the very wealthy, and their foreign origins added to their perceived potency and prestige. Yet alongside these developments, darker currents were flowing. The Renaissance period overlapped with the height of European witch hunts, and women's unexplained physical or mental symptoms could sometimes be interpreted as signs of witchcraft or demonic possession. A thin line sometimes separated the diagnosis of hysteria from accusations of supernatural influence, particularly for women of lower social classes or those who lacked powerful family protection. As the glow of candles flickers in our imaginary Renaissance chamber, we find ourselves moving forward once again into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Age of Enlightenment, when reason and science began to reshape understanding of the human mind and body. Yet for women experiencing anxiety, this enlightenment brought mixed blessings. Imagine now a physician's consulting room in 18th century London. Polished wood paneling reflects the warm light of oil lamps. A fashionably dressed woman sits describing symptoms to a doctor who prides himself on his modern scientific approach. She speaks of insomnia, palpitations, difficulty breathing, inexplicable fears, and a general sense of agitation. Though anatomists have now definitively disproven the concept of the wandering womb, the physician might still diagnose hysteria, vapors, or nervous weakness, terms that continue to be applied almost exclusively to women. Enlightenment-era treatments for women's anxiety began to focus more on the nervous system rather than the reproductive organs. Though the two were still considered closely linked, the concept of nervous sensibility emerged. The idea that some individuals, particularly educated women, possessed more delicate and reactive nerves than others. This refined nervous system was considered both a mark of superior breeding and a source of vulnerability to emotional distress. Treatments during this period often involved various forms of water therapy. Spas and bath towns flourished across Europe, where women might take the waters for nervous complaints. Different springs were recommended for different conditions, some for bathing, others for drinking. Complex regimens might involve specific sequences of immersion, drinking, and rest, often extending over weeks or months. Mechanical devices for treating anxiety began to appear, reflecting the era's fascination with technology. Various chairs, beds, and contraptions were designed to rock, swing, or rotate patients at carefully calibrated speeds and directions, supposedly calming the nerves through gentle motion. Some physicians prescribed carriage rides over specific types of terrain, believing that the particular rhythm and intensity of movement could rebalance the nervous system. Diet remained important in treating women's nervous disorders, though recommendations changed with evolving medical theories. Some physicians prescribed strengthening, stimulating foods to tone weak nerves, while others recommended bland, mild nourishment that wouldn't overtax sensitive constitutions. Tea, coffee, and chocolate, still relatively new to Europe, were variously prescribed or forbidden for anxious women, depending on medical fashion and individual doctors' theories. The 18th century also saw the rising use of pharmaceutical preparations specifically marketed for women's nervous complaints. Patent medicines with names like female pills, hysteric water, or tonic for ladies' nerves became popular, their secret formulas often containing varying combinations of herbs, alcohol, and sometimes opiates or other powerful substances. These were available without prescription and frequently advertised in newspapers and ladies' magazines, promising relief from anxiety, melancholy, and feminine weakness. As the Age of Enlightenment gave way to the Industrial Revolution, new theories about women's psychology and physiology emerged, along with new approaches to treating anxiety. The 19th century, particularly the Victorian era, would bring perhaps the most bizarre chapter yet in our history of women's anxiety treatments. Picture a well-appointed Victorian parlor, sometime in the 1870s. Heavy curtains filter the light, plush carpets muffle sound, and overstuffed furniture creates an atmosphere of comfortable confinement. A woman lies on a chaise-longue, her corset perhaps loosened slightly for comfort, as she describes to her physician sensations of choking, palpitations, insomnia, and inexplicable fears. The doctor, stroking his whiskers thoughtfully, makes his diagnosis hysteria, neurasthenia, or perhaps the vapors, all terms still in common medical use for what we would now recognize as anxiety or panic disorders. Victorian medicine had developed elaborate theories about women's nervous systems, often emphasizing their supposed constitutional weakness and vulnerability to emotional disturbance. The female body and mind were portrayed as inherently unstable, particularly in relation to reproductive functions. Puberty, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause were all seen as dangerous transitions that could trigger nervous disorders. Education, intellectual stimulation, and social activism were frequently warned against as potentially damaging to women's fragile nervous constitutions. Treatment options for Victorian women suffering from anxiety were diverse and often reflective of class differences. For wealthy women, the rest cure became a popular prescription developed by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell. This treatment involved complete bed rest for weeks or months, isolation from family and friends, prohibition of reading or intellectual activity, and a rich fattening diet, often including disturbing quantities of milk, cream, and butter. The woman would be kept in a darkened room, attended only by nurses, and sometimes subjected to daily massage and electrical stimulation of the muscles to prevent atrophy during extended immobilization. For women of the working classes, almost the opposite might be prescribed: the work cure, involving structured physical labor, believed to distract the mind from nervous preoccupations and strengthen the body. Class assumptions permeated these differing approaches. Wealthy women were considered to have exhausted their nervous energy through too much socializing or intellectual pursuit, while working class women were thought to benefit from the discipline and purpose that structured work provided. Hydrotherapy reached new levels of elaboration in Victorian treatment of women's anxiety. Water cures might involve precise sequences of hot and cold applications, showers, baths, wet sheet wraps, sitz baths, and douches directed at specific parts of the body. Each treatment would be calibrated for temperature, duration, and pressure, creating complex regimens that patients were expected to follow exactly. Some water cure establishments became fashionable retreats, where wealthy women might spend months following such regimens while enjoying the company of other patients in similar circumstances. Electrotherapy also gained popularity for treating feminine nervous disorders. Various devices delivered mild electrical currents to different parts of the body, supposedly stimulating sluggish nerves or calming overactive ones. Some of these devices were used in doctors' offices, while others were marketed for home use, allowing women to self-administer electrical treatments in the privacy of their own bedrooms. Perhaps the most notorious treatment for women's anxiety in the Victorian era was pelvic massage, performed by physicians to treat hysteria. This practice, which often induced what doctors clinically termed hysterical paroxysm, what we would now recognize as sexual orgasm, was considered a legitimate medical treatment. The release of tension this provided was observed to temporarily relieve anxiety symptoms in many patients. The procedure became so common that mechanical vibrators were eventually developed as labor-saving devices for physicians, becoming some of the first electrical appliances marketed for home use, advertised discreetly in women's magazines as providing relief of tension and calming of nerves. Surgical interventions for women's anxiety also emerged during this period. Ovarotomy, the removal of healthy ovaries, was performed on thousands of women diagnosed with hysteria or other nervous disorders. The procedure was based on the theory that the ovaries exercised a mysterious and potentially harmful influence over women's nervous systems. Some prominent gynecologists claimed extraordinarily high success rates for curing anxiety through this drastic surgical approach. Less invasive but equally misguided treatments included the application of leeches to the genitals, designed to reduce supposed congestion or inflammation that was believed to irritate the nerves. Caustic substances might be applied to the clitoris if it was considered oversensitive and potentially contributing to nervous excitability. These painful and invasive procedures reflect how medical authority was often exercised over women's bodies in ways that seem shockingly inappropriate by modern standards. As the Victorian era drew to a close and the dawn of the 20th century approached, new theories about women's anxiety were beginning to emerge. Psychoanalysis, developed by Sigmund Freud and his followers, would offer new explanations for anxiety, though not always more accurate or helpful ones. Our journey through the strange history of women's anxiety treatments would continue into modern times, but perhaps that's a story for another night. As you lie comfortably now, drifting towards sleep, consider how far our understanding of anxiety has come. The bizarre treatments of the past have largely given way to more effective and humane approaches based on better understanding of the mind and body. Yet echoes of these historical misconceptions sometimes persist in subtle ways in our culture. By remembering this strange history, we gain perspective on our present and appreciation for the advances that have been made in treating anxiety for women and for everyone who experiences this most human of emotions. As we continue our gentle journey through the strange history of women's anxiety treatments, let's turn our attention to the early 20th century, where new theories about the mind were beginning to reshape understanding of emotional distress. The Victorian era's physical treatments were gradually giving way to more psychological approaches, though many dubious practices continued alongside the emerging field of modern psychiatry. Imagine a tastefully decorated consulting room in Vienna around 1905. Oil paintings hang on wood-paneled walls, a Persian carpet covers the polished floor, and a now iconic piece of furniture, the psychoanalytic couch, occupies a prominent position. A woman reclines on this couch, speaking hesitantly about her anxiety symptoms, while Sigmund Freud himself sits just out of her sight, listening intently and occasionally making notes. Freud's approach to women's anxiety represented both a break from earlier treatments and a continuation of certain problematic assumptions. He rejected the idea that anxiety in women was primarily caused by physical disorders of the reproductive organs. Instead, he proposed that anxiety stemmed from unconscious conflicts, often of a sexual nature. Repressed desires, childhood traumas, and unresolved psychological issues were seen as the true sources of nervous symptoms. This shift from physical to psychological explanations might seem like progress, and in some ways it was. Women were no longer subjected to painful physical interventions like genital cauterization or ovariotomies as treatments for anxiety. Instead, they were invited to speak about their experiences, feelings, and dreams, a radical departure from earlier approaches that had often silenced women's own accounts of their distress. Yet early psychoanalytic theory often interpreted women's anxiety through a lens that reinforced certain cultural biases. Freud's concept of penis envy suggested that women's psychological development was fundamentally shaped by their reaction to lacking male genitalia. Their anxiety was frequently attributed to unconscious sexual conflicts, unresolved Oedipal issues, or repressed resentment of their feminine role. The talking cure gave women a voice, but often interpreted that voice within a framework that pathologized female experience. Psychoanalytic treatment for anxiety, whether in women or men, involved regular sessions over months or years, during which patients would engage in free association, reporting whatever thoughts came to mind, without censorship. The analyst would interpret these thoughts, drawing connections to unconscious conflicts, and gradually bringing them into conscious awareness. This process was believed to dissolve the psychic tension that manifested as anxiety. For wealthy women who could afford this lengthy and expensive treatment, psychoanalysis offered an alternative to the rest cures and surgical interventions of the previous era. Some found genuine relief through the opportunity to explore their feelings and experiences in a somewhat non-judgmental setting. Others encountered analysts who forced their narratives into predetermined theoretical frameworks, regardless of how well they fit the individual's actual experience. While Freud and his followers were developing psychoanalysis in Europe, American psychiatry was taking a somewhat different approach to women's anxiety. In the early 20th century, American psychiatric institutions still employed many physical treatments inherited from the Victorian era. Hydrotherapy remained popular, with prolonged warm baths prescribed to calm agitated patients. Various electrical treatments were used, including early versions of electroconvulsive therapy, which would later be refined and standardized. In American asylums and sanitariums, where women with severe anxiety or other psychological disorders, might be confined. The emphasis was often on creating a controlled environment, rather than exploring unconscious conflicts. Daily routines were strictly regulated, with specific times for meals, exercise, rest, and therapeutic activities. Occupational therapy, involving crafts, gardening, or light domestic work, was believed to provide structure and purpose that would help stabilize emotional states. The period between the two world wars saw the rise of biological psychiatry alongside psychoanalysis. New physical treatments for anxiety and other mental disorders were developed, some of which seem almost as shocking to modern sensibilities as Victorian interventions. Insulin coma therapy, introduced in the 1930s, involved inducing hypoglycemic comas in patients through insulin injections. Metrazole shock therapy used a chemical injection to induce seizures. Both treatments were used for various psychiatric conditions, including severe anxiety disorders, with the theory that the shock to the system might somehow reset the brain's functioning. At the same time, pharmaceutical approaches to anxiety were becoming more sophisticated. The barbiturates, first developed in the late 19th century, came into widespread use for sedation and anxiety reduction in the early 20th century. These powerful drugs could indeed reduce anxiety symptoms, but at the cost of significant sedation and high potential for dependence and overdose. Women were particularly likely to be prescribed these medications, reflecting a continuing tendency to medicate rather than address the social and psychological roots of female distress. The mid-20th century brought revolutionary changes to psychiatric treatment with the development of new classes of psychiatric medications. In 1955, the first benzodiazepine, Librium, was synthesized, followed soon after by Valium. These drugs quickly became known as Mother's Little Helpers, reflecting their widespread prescription to women experiencing anxiety. Though more effective and somewhat safer than barbiturates, these medications still carried risks of dependence and side effects. Their popularity among women patients revealed the continuing tendency to treat women's emotional distress through chemical means, rather than addressing underlying personal and social issues. Imagine a suburban American living room in the early 1960s. A housewife sits with her family physician, describing feelings of restlessness, worry, and difficulty sleeping. Her home is immaculate, her children well cared for, her husband successful. She has, by the standards of her society, everything a woman should want. Yet she feels empty, anxious, constantly on edge. The doctor nods sympathetically and reaches for his prescription pad. The solution is a small yellow pill, Valium, which will smooth the rough edges of her emotions without requiring any deeper examination of why she feels as she does. This scene played out countless times during what some historians have called the Age of Anxiety in post-war America. The widespread prescription of anti-anxiety medications to women reflected both advances in psychopharmacology and continuing blind spots in understanding women's psychological needs. Betty Friedan would famously describe this situation as the problem with no name in her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, arguing that many women's anxiety stemmed not from intrinsic psychological defects, but from the limited roles available to them in mid-century American society. While pharmaceutical treatments dominated mainstream approaches to women's anxiety in the mid-20th century, alternative perspectives were developing that would eventually transform understanding of women's mental health. Feminist therapy emerged in the 1960s and 70s, explicitly addressing the social and political contexts of women's psychological distress. These approaches recognized that women's anxiety often had roots in real experiences of discrimination, limited opportunities, and cultural devaluation, rather than merely reflecting internal pathology. Feminist therapists introduced the radical notion that women's anger and anxiety might be appropriate responses to their circumstances, rather than symptoms to be eliminated. They developed approaches that emphasized empowerment, consciousness raising, and social change alongside individual healing. Group therapy formats allowed women to share experiences and recognize patterns of oppression, reducing the isolation that often exacerbated anxiety symptoms. The late 20th century also saw the development of more integrated approaches to treating anxiety in women and men alike. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which emerged in the 1960s and gained widespread acceptance in subsequent decades, focused on identifying and changing thought patterns that contribute to anxiety. Unlike psychoanalysis, which might spend years exploring unconscious roots of anxiety, CBT offered practical techniques for managing symptoms and typically involved shorter treatment periods. Research has consistently supported its effectiveness for many anxiety disorders. Mindfulness-based approaches, drawing on Buddhist meditation practices but adapted for secular therapeutic contexts, gained popularity beginning in the 1980s. These techniques taught patients to observe their anxious thoughts and sensations without judgment or reactivity, gradually reducing their power to trigger distress. For women whose anxiety had been treated as something to be suppressed or eliminated, the mindfulness approach offered a different perspective, the possibility of relating differently to anxiety, rather than fighting against it. Advances in neuroscience over recent decades have led to more sophisticated understandings of the biological aspects of anxiety disorders. Brain imaging studies have identified neural circuits involved in fear and anxiety responses, while genetic research has explored hereditary factors that may increase vulnerability to anxiety disorders. These biological insights have helped destigmatize anxiety by emphasizing its basis in brain function rather than personal weakness or moral failing. Yet these biological approaches carry their own risks when applied to women's mental health. The tendency to reduce complex psychological experiences to neurotransmitter imbalances can sometimes recapitulate older patterns of dismissing women's lived experiences and social contexts. A purely biological approach might lead to medication as the first and only treatment offered, even when psychological or social interventions might be more appropriate and effective in the long term. Having explored the evolution of women's anxiety treatments from ancient times through the 20th century, let's now delve deeper into some of the most intriguing and unusual specific treatments that have been applied throughout history. These detailed case studies offer fascinating windows into how different cultures and time periods understood and responded to women's emotional distress. Imagine yourself in Hellenistic Egypt around 200 BCE in the great city of Alexandria. The library is flourishing. Scholars from around the Mediterranean gather to exchange ideas, and medical knowledge from Greek, Egyptian, and other traditions intermingles and evolves. In a physician's house near the harbor, a young woman named Berenike sits quietly while a doctor named Herophilus examines her. She has been experiencing episodes of breathlessness, palpitations, and a sensation of choking, particularly when in crowded marketplaces or when her husband is away on trading voyages. Herophilus is considered the greatest anatomist of his age, having performed human dissections, a practice rarely permitted in the ancient world, and made groundbreaking discoveries about the nervous system. Yet even this exceptional physician diagnoses Berenike with hysteria caused by a wandering womb. His treatment, however, incorporates several sophisticated elements drawn from multiple medical traditions. First, he prescribes a regimen of circle therapy, a treatment unique to the Alexandrian medical tradition. Berenike will be seated in a wooden chair suspended from the ceiling by ropes. The chair will be set spinning at a precise speed determined by the physician, then allowed to slow naturally. This rotation was believed to reposition the wandering womb through centrifugal force, while also rebalancing the bodily humors through the rhythmic motion. After the spinning treatment, Berenike receives an application of heated glass cups to her lower abdomen, an early form of cupping therapy. The suction created by these cups was thought to draw the womb downward into its proper position, Finally, she is given a complex herbal preparation containing ingredients from Egypt, Greece, and imported from as far as India, including hellebore, crocus, myrrh, and cinnamon. What makes this Alexandrian approach notable is its integration of physical manipulation, pharmacological intervention, and carefully calibrated movements, a surprisingly comprehensive treatment strategy that would not be out of place in concept, though certainly in specifics in more modern holistic approaches. Let's move forward in time to Song Dynasty China around 1100 CE. Here, a woman named Liu is experiencing what we would recognize as severe anxiety, with symptoms including insomnia, excessive worrying, and occasional panic attacks. Chinese medicine took a very different approach to women's emotional distress than Western traditions, seeing it not as a disorder of the reproductive organs, but as an imbalance in the body's energy system. Liu consults a female physician trained in the traditions of Chinese medicine, rather than attributing her symptoms to a wandering womb or excessive emotionality as Western doctors might. The physician identifies a disturbance in the flow of qi vital energy and an imbalance between yin and yang forces. Liu's specific diagnosis is heart and kidney disharmony with rising liver fire, conceptualizations that have no direct equivalent in Western medicine. Her treatment is equally distinct from Western approaches. First, she receives acupuncture, with needles placed at specific points along meridians, energy channels, believed to regulate emotions and calm the spirit. Particular attention is paid to the heart, pericardium, and liver meridians, which were associated with emotional balance. Following the acupuncture session, Liu is prescribed a customized herbal formula containing ingredients such as baishao, white peony, chaihu, buplurum, and swanzao ren, sour jujube seed. Unlike Western prescriptions, which often used standardized preparations, Chinese herbal formulas were individualized based on the specific pattern of disharmony identified in each patient. Liu is also taught specific qigong exercises, gentle movements coordinated with breathing techniques designed to restore balance to the body's energy systems. She is instructed to practice these movements daily, particularly at dawn when yang energy is ascending. Her diet is adjusted to avoid foods considered heating, which might exacerbate her liver fire, and to include more cooling foods that would nourish yin. What's striking about this Chinese approach is its integration of physical, energetic, and lifestyle interventions, all based on a coherent theoretical framework entirely different from the Western understanding of anxiety. Many elements of this traditional approach continue in modified form today, both in China and increasingly in complementary medicine worldwide. Let's travel now to medieval Islamic Spain, around 1150 CE, to the city of Cordoba. Here, a woman named Aisha seeks treatment for anxiety symptoms from a physician trained in the Unani medical tradition, which blended Greek medical theory with Islamic medicine and influences from Persian and Indian healing systems. Unani medicine, like Greek medicine, operated on the theory of the four humors, but it developed this concept further with sophisticated understandings of temperament. Aisha's physician, after careful examination of her pulse, urine, facial appearance, and detailed questioning about her symptoms, determines that she is suffering from an excess of black bile and a disturbance of the Qudwat Nafsani psychic force. Her treatment begins with lifestyle modifications designed to restore balance. This includes carefully regulated sleep schedules, sleeping with her head elevated to prevent black bile from rising to the brain, specific dietary recommendations, avoiding melancholic foods like eggplant and lentils, and a regimen of gentle exercise in pleasant gardens. The physician also prescribes a fascinating treatment known as music therapy, Ilaish Bilgina, which was highly developed in medieval Islamic medicine. Specific musical modes, makamat were matched to different temperaments and conditions. For Aisha's melancholic anxiety, the physician prescribes listening to compositions in the rast and ushak modes, which were believed to dispel sadness and fear. Aromatherapy features prominently in her treatment as well. Aisha is instructed to keep certain fragrant substances nearby throughout the day, particularly amber, musk, and saffron, which were considered effective in countering melancholy and strengthening the psychic forces. Her home is to be perfumed with specific incense combinations at particular times of day. Finally, she receives medication in the form of an elaborate compound preparation called majan naja, containing dozens of carefully balanced ingredients including lapis lazuli, which was believed to specifically treat melancholy, pearl, coral, gold filings, various herbs, and honey as a base. This preparation would be taken in precise doses at specific times relative to meals and prayer times. The Islamic approach to treating women's anxiety is notable for its sophisticated integration of physical, sensory, spiritual, and pharmacological elements, all precisely calibrated to the individual patient's specific humoral imbalance and temperament. Many treatments developed during this golden age of Islamic medicine would later influence European medical practices during the Renaissance. Let's turn our attention now to a very different cultural context: traditional healing practices among certain Native American tribes in what is now the southwestern United States around 1800 CE. Here, a Navajo woman experiencing anxiety symptoms might undergo a healing ceremony known as a sing or chant performed by a trained medicine person. The Navajo understanding of anxiety differed fundamentally from European approaches. Rather than seeing it as a disorder of the body or mind individually, it was understood as a disruption in the proper relationship between the person and the natural and spiritual worlds. The woman's symptoms, which might include fear, sleep disturbances, or physical manifestations like trembling, would be interpreted as signs of disharmony requiring restoration of balance. The healing ceremony might last for several days and involve elaborate sand paintings created on the floor of the Hogan traditional dwelling. These intricate patterns, made from colored sands, depicted spiritual beings and cosmic forces. The designs weren't merely decorative, but were considered actual manifestations of healing power that could absorb negative elements, causing the woman's distress. Throughout the ceremony, specific chants would be performed, sometimes lasting hours, with precise sequences of sounds believed to restore harmony. The woman would sit on specific sections of the sand painting during particular phases of the ceremony, absorbing its healing influences. Various herbal preparations might be used, including those made from sage, cedar, or other plants considered sacred. What distinguishes this approach from Western medical treatments is its fundamentally communal and spiritual nature. The woman's anxiety wasn't seen as her individual pathology, but as a signal of imbalance that concerned her entire community. The ceremony involved family members and community participation, addressing not just her symptoms, but the web of relationships surrounding her. This holistic approach recognized connections between emotional well-being, physical health, social relationships, and spiritual harmony long before Western medicine began to acknowledge such interconnections. Though the specific explanatory framework differs dramatically from modern biomedical understandings, the recognition of these complex interactions represents a sophisticated approach to emotional healing. Returning to Europe, let's explore another unusual treatment that gained popularity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries: therapeutic magnetism, later known as mesmerism, developed by Franz Anton Mesmer. Though used for various conditions, it became particularly associated with treating women's nervous disorders. Imagine a fashionable Parisian salon around 1785. A group of elegantly dressed women sit around a curious apparatus, the baquet, a large wooden tub filled with water, iron filings and bottles arranged in specific patterns. Iron rods protrude from the tub, which patients would hold or press against parts of their bodies experiencing distress. The room is dimly lit, with ethereal music playing softly in the background, often from a glass harmonica, an instrument believed to enhance the magnetic effects. Dr. Mesmer moves among his patients, occasionally touching them with a wand or simply making passes with his hands near their bodies without contact. He believes he is directing an invisible natural force, animal magnetism, that flows through all living things but becomes blocked or imbalanced in cases of illness or distress. By manipulating this magnetic fluid, he claims to restore proper flow and thus relieve anxiety, melancholy, and various physical complaints. The sessions often produce dramatic effects. Some women experience convulsions or enter trance-like states. Others report sensations of heat or tingling flowing through their bodies. Many claim significant relief from their anxiety symptoms following these magnetic treatments. The atmosphere is charged with expectation, suggestion, and the powerful social dynamics of the group setting. What makes mesmerism particularly interesting in the history of women's anxiety treatments is its liminal position between physical and psychological approaches. Though Mesmer himself believed he was manipulating a physical force, later analysts would recognize that he was actually harnessing the power of suggestion and what we would now call the placebo effect. His methods would eventually lead to the development of hypnotherapy and influence early psychotherapy, representing an important bridge between purely physical treatments and psychological approaches. The French Revolution brought scrutiny to Mesmer's methods, and a commission including Benjamin Franklin and Antoine Lavoisier investigated his claims. They concluded that while patients did experience real effects, these resulted from imagination and suggestion rather than any magnetic fluid. Nevertheless, mesmerism continued to evolve and influence therapeutic approaches well into the 19th century. Let's explore another curious treatment that emerged in the 19th century, specifically targeting women's anxiety: the change of air or travel cure. While travel for health has ancient roots, it developed into a specific therapeutic approach for anxious women during the Victorian era, particularly among the upper classes. Imagine an English physician's office in London around 1860. A well-dressed woman describes her symptoms: insomnia, fatigue, palpitations, and persistent worry. After examining her, the doctor pronounces his diagnosis: nervous exhaustion complicated by the unfavorable London climate. His prescription is not medication but travel, specifically a carefully structured therapeutic journey to selected locations with beneficial air. The travel cure was based on the theory that different airs and climates had specific effects on the nervous system. Mountain air was considered bracing and strengthening for those with weak nerves. Sea air was thought to be calming yet invigorating. The dry air of desert regions was prescribed for some nervous conditions, while the humid air of certain spa towns was recommended for others. A woman prescribed the travel cure would receive detailed instructions about her itinerary, which might last months or even years, including which locations to visit in which seasons, how long to stay in each place, which local waters to drink or bathe in, and what level of social activity to engage in. Some physicians specialized in this form of treatment, writing elaborate treatises on the specific properties of air in different European and Mediterranean locations. The therapeutic journey might begin with a stay at a quiet seaside resort on the English coast, followed by a carefully timed progression to the Swiss Alps in summer, the Italian lakes in autumn, and perhaps Egypt or the French Riviera for winter. At each location, the patient would follow a regimen of gentle exercise, appropriate social engagements, and specific exposures to the local air, sitting by the sea during particular hours or taking walks at precise elevations in mountain locations. What makes the travel cure fascinating is how it combined genuine therapeutic elements, change of environment, relief from domestic stresses, moderate exercise with elaborate theoretical justifications about air quality and atmospheric influences. For women whose anxiety was exacerbated by restrictive domestic circumstances or unhappy marriages, the prescription for extended travel could provide a socially acceptable escape that might indeed improve their symptoms, regardless of the supposed effects of different airs. The travel cure also reflects the class dimensions of anxiety treatment, available only to wealthy women who could afford extended journeys with servants and appropriate accommodations. For working class women with similar symptoms, very different treatments would be prescribed, often involving moral discipline and return to productive labor rather than restorative leisure. As the evening draws on and you perhaps feel the gentle pull of sleep approaching, let's explore one final unusual treatment from the early 20th century, the wilderness cure for neurasthenia and anxiety that became popular in America between approximately 1900 and 1930. Pioneered by physicians like Silas Weir Mitchell, who had earlier developed the rest cure, the wilderness cure sent anxious patients, particularly those diagnosed with neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion, away from the supposedly enervating influences of modern civilization into remote natural settings. This approach was more commonly prescribed for men than women, but a significant number of women, particularly those considered to have masculine temperaments or intellectual interests, received this treatment as well. Imagine a female novelist suffering from anxiety and creative blockage, consulting a neurologist in Boston around 1905. After diagnosing neurasthenia brought on by excessive cerebration and the artificial stimulation of urban life, the doctor prescribes not rest but a 3-month sojourn at a rustic camp in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. The wilderness cure was based on theories about the harmful effects of modern civilization on the nervous system. Electric lights, telephones, crowded cities, and the constant mental stimulation of contemporary life were believed to deplete nervous energy and disturb natural biological rhythms. The antidote was immersion in nature, simple living, and physical activity in the open air. Upon arriving at the Adirondack camp, our novelist would find a rustic but comfortable cabin, deliberately free of modern conveniences. The daily schedule would involve early rising with the sun, simple meals of fresh local foods, often including large quantities of milk, eggs, and meat believed to rebuild nervous strengths, and a program of gradually increasing physical activities in the outdoors. These activities might include hiking, fishing, canoeing, or even hunting, pursuits that required physical exertion, practical focus, and engagement with the natural world. Evening entertainment would be limited to conversation, reading by lamplight, or listening to simple music. Early bedtime was enforced, synchronized with natural darkness. The theoretical basis for the wilderness cure combined elements of evolutionary thinking, the belief that humans were biologically adapted to natural environments rather than artificial urban settings, early ecological awareness, and a distinctly American idealization of frontier experiences. Proponents argued that modern life had created artificial nervous disorders that required natural treatments. What makes the wilderness cure particularly interesting is how it inverted some traditional gender assumptions about appropriate treatments. While the rest cure had enforced passivity for women deemed overstimulated by intellectual activity, the wilderness cure prescribed active engagement with the physical world, traditionally a more masculine therapeutic approach. For women who found the enforced passivity of rest cures intolerable, the wilderness cure could offer a more appealing alternative, though it remained available primarily to those of privileged social and economic status. As we conclude this exploration of some of the most unusual treatments for women's anxiety throughout history, perhaps you're feeling the peaceful heaviness of approaching sleep. These historical approaches, from spinning chairs in Alexandria to wilderness cures in the Adirondacks, might seem strange or even misguided to modern sensibilities. Yet each represented a genuine attempt to address human suffering using the best understanding available within its cultural context. What connects these diverse approaches across time and cultures is the recognition that anxiety, that most universal of human emotions, requires attention and care. The specific forms this care has taken reflect not just evolving medical knowledge but broader cultural values, gender assumptions, and social structures. By understanding this rich historical tapestry, we gain perspective on our contemporary approaches to anxiety, their strengths, limitations, and cultural embeddedness. As you drift towards sleep, consider how our current understanding of anxiety continues to evolve. Future generations may look back on our treatments with the same mixture of curiosity, criticism, and appreciation with which we view these historical approaches. In that ongoing evolution of healing practices, we participate in humanity's enduring effort to ease suffering and find balance amid life's inevitable uncertainties. Sleep well, carrying with you these stories of humanity's long quest to understand and soothe the anxious mind, a quest that connects us across centuries and cultures in our shared vulnerability and resilience. Now that we've explored various historical approaches to treating women's anxiety, let's turn our attention to some truly peculiar case studies, documented instances where unusual or extreme treatments were applied to individual women. These cases provide fascinating windows into how theories about women's mental health were applied in practice, often with consequences that ranged from merely ineffective to actively harmful. As you settle more comfortably into your resting position, perhaps pulling a blanket closer or adjusting your pillow, imagine a well-appointed doctor's office in Paris, 1875. Here we find the case of Marie, a 28-year-old woman from a wealthy family who has been brought to the renowned neurologist Jules Cotard. Her family reports that she suffers from persistent fears, episodes of trembling, and an obsessive concern that disasters will befall her loved ones. Dr. Cotard, after examining Marie, diagnoses her with cerebral hyperemia, an excessive blood flow to the brain that he believes is causing her anxiety symptoms. His prescribed treatment is remarkable for its invasiveness, the application of refrigeration to Marie's spine and scalp to reduce the supposed excess blood flow to her brain. The treatment proceeds with Marie lying on a special table, her hair removed to expose her scalp. A device known as a spinal ice bag, an early form of ice pack shaped to fit along the spine, is applied to her back. Simultaneously, a refrigeration cap filled with ice and salt is fitted to her head. She must remain in this position for 2 hours daily, the intense cold causing physical discomfort that borders on pain. To modern sensibilities, this treatment seems not only ineffective, but actively torturous. Yet Dr. Cotard, considered a leading neurologist of his time, firmly believed in the physiological basis of his approach. His case notes on Marie document that after 3 weeks of daily refrigeration sessions, her anxiety symptoms showed marked improvement. Whether this represented actual relief or simply Marie's desire to end the uncomfortable treatments remains an open question. Dr. Cotard combined this physical treatment with what he called moral therapy, a regimen of strictly scheduled activities, limited social interaction, and daily lectures on proper feminine behavior and emotional control. Marie was instructed to avoid reading novels believed to overstimulate female emotions, limit conversation to practical matters, and focus on simple domestic activities like needlework. This case exemplifies how medical authority could be used to enforce social norms under the guise of treating psychological symptoms. Marie's anxiety, which may have had legitimate basis in the restrictive expectations placed on women of her class, was interpreted as physical pathology requiring physical intervention, while simultaneously being addressed through reinforcement of the very social strictures that may have contributed to her distress. Let's move to a very different setting, a private asylum in England, 1887. Here we find Catherine, a 32-year-old woman committed by her husband after what he described as hysterical outbursts following the death of their young child. Today, we would likely recognize Catherine's symptoms as grief complicated by depression and anxiety, but in Victorian England her emotional responses were pathologized as a form of female hysteria. Catherine's case is documented in the asylum's medical records because of the unusual treatment applied ovarian compression. This strange therapeutic approach involved the application of mechanical pressure to the ovaries using a specially designed belt or harness fitted with plates that could be tightened against the lower abdomen. The theoretical basis for this treatment stemmed from the belief that the ovaries exercised a powerful and potentially destabilizing influence on the female nervous system. By compressing them, doctors believed they could suppress their excessive activity and calm the resulting emotional disturbances. Catherine was required to wear this device for up to 12 hours daily. The pressure adjusted to a level that caused significant discomfort but stopped short of unbearable pain. The asylum physician's notes describe Catherine as initially resistant to the treatment, attempting to loosen or remove the compression device when left unattended. This non-compliance was interpreted not as a reasonable response to pain and restriction but as further evidence of her hysteria. As a result, her treatment was intensified to include brief periods of complete isolation when she resisted the compression therapy. After 6 months in the asylum, Catherine's medical record indicates her successful treatment and discharge. The notes describe her as subdued in manner, accepting of her situation and no longer displaying hysterical tendencies. A follow-up letter from her husband 3 months later praises the asylum for returning his wife to him much improved in temperament and demeanor. From our modern perspective, it appears that what was treated was not Catherine's legitimate grief and emotional distress, but her willingness to express emotions that made others uncomfortable. The ovarian compression therapy, along with the asylum's restrictive environment, served to break her resistance and enforce compliance with social expectations rather than address her psychological needs. The early 20th century brought new approaches to treating women's anxiety, some of which seem equally misguided in retrospect. Consider the case of Elizabeth, a 45-year-old American woman treated in 1915 at a prestigious private sanitarium in New York. Elizabeth, a school teacher and unmarried, had sought medical help for what she described as nervous exhaustion manifesting as insomnia, digestive disturbances, and pervasive worry about her future. The physician who examined Elizabeth diagnosed her with involutional melancholia, a term used to describe depression and anxiety occurring during middle age, particularly in women approaching menopause. His treatment plan was based on the emerging field of organotherapy, the use of animal organ extracts to treat human conditions. Elizabeth's treatment consisted of daily injections of ovarian extract derived from cows combined with thyroid extract. The theoretical basis for this approach was the belief that her anxiety stemmed from declining ovarian function, creating a hormonal imbalance that affected both her physical and emotional well-being. The animal organ extracts were believed to supplement her declining natural hormones and thus alleviate her symptoms. These injections, crude forerunners of modern hormone replacement therapy, contained unpurified animal tissue that could cause significant side effects including fever, inflammation at the injection site, and allergic reactions. Elizabeth's medical records document that she experienced all these side effects yet was encouraged to continue the treatment. Alongside the organotherapy, Elizabeth received another treatment common in early 20th century sanitariums, intestinal lavage. Based on the theory that auto-intoxication from intestinal contents contributed to nervous disorders, she underwent regular colonic irrigation procedures using various solutions, including dilute carbolic acid, a substance we now recognize as potentially harmful when absorbed through the intestinal mucosa. After 3 months of this combined treatment regimen, Elizabeth was discharged from the sanitarium. Her medical records indicate moderate improvement in her symptoms, though a follow-up note 6 months later mentions her return with similar complaints. This time, her physician recommended a more radical intervention: surgical removal of her ovaries to eliminate the supposed source of her nervous symptoms once and for all. Elizabeth's case illustrates the medical tendency to reduce women's psychological distress to reproductive function, even as theories evolved from wandering wombs to hormonal imbalances. It also demonstrates how women's anxiety could lead to increasingly invasive treatments when initial approaches failed, often with little evidence to support their efficacy. Let's move to a very different cultural context with the case of Fatima, a young woman in Ottoman Turkey in the early 19th century. Fatima's symptoms, recorded by a court physician in 1815, included episodes of uncontrollable trembling, difficulty breathing, and persistent fears that she described as a shadow following me even in bright sunlight. Today we might recognize these as symptoms of an anxiety disorder, possibly with panic attacks. Fatima's treatment is noteworthy because it combined elements from multiple medical traditions: Ottoman, Persian, Greek, and Islamic, reflecting the culturally diverse approach to medicine in the Ottoman Empire. Her initial treatment involved the creation of a talisman, a small leather pouch containing verses from the Quran written on paper mixed with specific herbs and minerals believed to counter anxiety. When this proved insufficient, Fatima was prescribed a more elaborate treatment, immersion therapy in the natural hot springs at Bursa. This wasn't simply bathing but a carefully structured regimen involving specific sequences of immersion in pools of different temperatures and mineral content, combined with massage using scented oils and the application of heated stones to particular points on the body associated with emotional balance. The most unusual aspect of Fatima's treatment, however, was the musical therapy she received. Ottoman medicine had developed sophisticated theories about the relationship between musical modes, makams, and emotional states. Fatima was prescribed daily sessions of listening to compositions in specific makams performed live by court musicians. Different melodic patterns were played at precisely determined times of day, coordinated with her other treatments, and with astronomical conditions believed to influence their effectiveness. What makes Fatima's case particularly interesting is that her treatments, while based on theories we might now consider unscientific, avoided the invasive physical interventions often imposed on European women with similar symptoms during the same historical period. The Ottoman approach emphasized harmony and balance rather than the suppression or control of supposed pathology, potentially offering a more humane experience for the patient even if the theoretical framework was pre-modern. As we continue our journey through these historical case studies, let's consider a more recent example that bridges traditional and modern approaches to women's anxiety. In rural Appalachia in the 1930s, we find the case of Sarah, a 35-year-old mother of 5 whose anxiety symptoms were treated through a fascinating combination of folk medicine and emerging pharmaceutical approaches. Sarah's symptoms, described in the field notes of a doctor participating in a public health survey, included nervous spells characterized by trembling, heart palpitations, and fears that frequently kept her housebound. The local community recognized her condition as nerves or nervous weakness, a common diagnosis in Appalachian folk medicine that encompassed various anxiety and depressive symptoms. The traditional treatment Sarah initially received from a community healer involved several elements drawn from Appalachian folk practices. She was given a nerve tonic to drink daily, containing herbs like lady's slipper, skullcap, and passion flower steeped in apple cider vinegar. These herbs, some of which have mild sedative properties, had been used for generations in the region to treat anxiety symptoms. Another traditional element of her treatment involved the wearing of a specific worry stone, a smooth river rock that had been charmed through a ritual involving passage through the hands of 7 widows during a waning moon. Sarah was instructed to hold this stone whenever she felt a nervous spell coming on, rubbing it with her thumb while practicing specific breathing patterns. What makes this case particularly interesting is that these traditional approaches were soon supplemented by early pharmaceutical interventions. The visiting doctor, while documenting local healing practices, also provided Sarah with phenobarbital, an early sedative hypnotic drug that was becoming widely prescribed for anxiety in the 1930s. This created a hybrid treatment approach that Sarah herself integrated according to her needs, using the traditional remedies for daily management and the pharmaceutical option for more severe episodes. The doctor's notes indicate his surprise at finding that Sarah maintained her own sophisticated understanding of when to use each approach. She reported that the herbal tonic provided gentle easing of her everyday nervousness without the drowsiness caused by the phenobarbital, which she reserved for what she called true spells, likely what we would now recognize as panic attacks. This case offers a rare documented instance of a woman actively navigating between traditional and modern medical paradigms, exercising agency in her own treatment rather than being simply a passive recipient. As the evening deepens and perhaps your eyelids grow heavier, let's explore one final case study that highlights how celebrity and social status could influence the treatment of women's anxiety. In the 1950s, a prominent American actress whose name was redacted in the published case study for confidentiality reasons sought treatment for what she described as overwhelming anxiety that was interfering with her career. This actress, at the height of her fame, had access to the most sophisticated psychiatric treatments available at the time. Her initial treatment involved psychoanalysis with a prominent Freudian analyst, 4 sessions weekly over 18 months. When this produced limited improvement in her anxiety symptoms, her psychiatrist recommended a then experimental approach, pharmacological enhancement of psychotherapy. The actress became one of the early patients to receive combined treatment with a newly developed benzodiazepine tranquilizer and continued psychoanalysis. Her psychiatrist published paper on the case with identifying details removed, described how the medication allowed her to engage more productively in the analytic process by reducing her overwhelming anxiety to manageable levels. What makes this case particularly noteworthy is how her celebrity status influenced her treatment in contradictory ways. On one hand, she had access to cutting-edge treatments before they became widely available to the general public. On the other hand, her public image created additional complications in her therapy. Her medical records note the psychiatrist's observations about how the pressure to maintain her screen persona, always poised, always beautiful, always in control, had intensified her underlying anxiety and created barriers to authentic emotional expression, even in the therapeutic setting. The case also illustrates the beginning of a major shift in treating women's anxiety, the emergence of combined approaches that addressed both biological and psychological dimensions. This actress's treatment pointed toward what would eventually become standard practice for anxiety disorders, an integration of pharmacological and psychotherapeutic interventions tailored to individual needs. As we conclude this exploration of individual women's experiences with anxiety treatments throughout history, a common thread emerges, from Marie's ice caps to Catherine's ovarian compression, from Elizabeth's animal extracts to the unnamed actress's early tranquilizers. We see how women's bodies and minds have often been sites for medical experimentation and intervention. Yet we also see glimmers of women's resilience and agency, whether in Catherine's initial resistance to her treatment, Sarah's strategic integration of traditional and modern approaches, or Fatima's experience of a more holistic healing tradition. These historical cases remind us that treatments for anxiety have never been merely technical medical interventions. They have always been embedded in cultural assumptions about gender, emotion, and the proper social roles of women. The theories and treatments have evolved dramatically over time, yet certain patterns persist, particularly the tendency to locate women's distress in their bodies, rather than in their life circumstances, and to pathologize emotional responses that might be reasonable reactions to restrictive or traumatic experiences. As your consciousness perhaps begins to drift toward sleep, consider how the history of women's anxiety treatments offers both cautionary tales and reasons for hope. The more extreme interventions of earlier eras have largely been abandoned, and contemporary approaches increasingly recognize the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors in women's emotional well-being. Women themselves have gained greater voice in their own treatment, though disparities and biases certainly persist. The long and winding road from wandering womb theories to modern integrated treatments represents not just advancing medical knowledge, but evolving cultural attitudes toward women's minds and emotions. By remembering these historical experiences, sometimes strange, sometimes troubling, sometimes touching in their humanity, we gain perspective on our contemporary approaches to anxiety and the journey still ahead toward truly understanding and addressing this most human of emotional experiences. As sleep perhaps begins to envelop you, carrying you away from these historical journeys, you might reflect on how, throughout history, the experience of anxiety itself has remained remarkably consistent even as explanations and treatments have transformed. The racing heart, the shortness of breath, the persistent worries, these experiences connect women across centuries and cultures, from Egyptian priestesses to Victorian ladies, to modern professionals. In that shared human experience lies a profound connection that transcends time and reminds us of our common humanity. Rest peacefully now, carrying with you these stories of women throughout history who, like all of us, sought understanding and relief from the burden of anxiety. Their experiences, even the difficult ones, form part of the long human story of seeking wellness and balance amid life's inevitable uncertainties. As we arrive at the final chapter of our exploration into the strange history of women's anxiety treatments, let's consider how historical approaches continue to echo in contemporary practice, while also acknowledging the remarkable progress that has been made. This perspective can help us understand both how far we've come and what challenges remain in addressing women's mental health needs. As you settle more deeply into a comfortable position, perhaps noticing the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, let's begin by examining how certain themes from historical treatments persist in subtle forms today. The ancient concept of the wandering womb may seem absurdly outdated, yet contemporary medicine still sometimes exhibits a tendency to attribute women's psychological symptoms to reproductive functions. Consider how premenstrual mood changes are sometimes pathologized rather than recognized as normal physiological variations, or how perimenopausal anxiety may be treated primarily as a hormonal issue without adequate attention to psychological and social dimensions. The ancient Egyptian fumigation treatments and Victorian pelvic massages have thankfully disappeared, but the underlying assumption that women's emotional states are predominantly governed by their reproductive organs sometimes persists in more subtle forms. The historical tendency to prescribe different treatments based on social class also continues in modified ways. While the stark contrast between rest cures for wealthy women and work cures for poor women has disappeared, socioeconomic disparities in access to mental health care remain significant. Women with greater financial resources can access a wide range of therapy options, complementary treatments, and wellness approaches, while those with fewer resources may receive only brief medication management or no treatment at all. Even the Victorian emphasis on rest versus stimulation finds echoes in contemporary debates about optimal approaches to anxiety management. Some modern treatments emphasize the importance of relaxation techniques, stress reduction, and creating boundaries around potential triggers, approaches that share certain philosophical elements with the Victorian rest cure, albeit without its extreme restrictions. Other approaches emphasize engagement, exposure to fears, and building resilience through gradually facing anxiety-provoking situations, conceptually related to the more active treatments historically prescribed for working-class women. The psychoanalytic approach, which dominated much of 20th century treatment for women's anxiety, has evolved significantly but continues to influence contemporary practice. While few therapists now interpret women's anxiety through strictly Freudian lenses, the emphasis on understanding how early experiences and unconscious patterns shape current emotional responses remains important in many therapeutic approaches. Modern psychodynamic therapy represents a more nuanced evolution of these ideas, typically without the gender biases that characterized earlier psychoanalytic thought. Pharmaceutical treatments for anxiety have become increasingly sophisticated since the early benzodiazepines of the mid-20th century. Contemporary medications target specific neurotransmitter systems believed to be involved in anxiety disorders, with fewer side effects and lower dependence potential than earlier drugs. Yet the pattern of prescribing psychotropic medications more frequently to women than men continues, raising questions about whether women's emotional distress is still more likely to be medicalized than men's. What truly distinguishes contemporary approaches from historical treatments is the growing recognition of how social and cultural factors shape women's experiences of anxiety. Feminist therapy, which emerged in the 1960s and has continuously evolved, explicitly addresses how gender socialization, power dynamics, and structural inequalities contribute to women's psychological distress. Rather than locating pathology within individual women, this approach recognizes how reasonable responses to challenging circumstances can manifest as anxiety symptoms. The biopsychosocial model, which has gained increasing acceptance in recent decades, provides a framework for integrating biological, psychological, and social understanding of anxiety disorders. This approach recognizes that women's anxiety may involve complex interactions between genetic predispositions, hormonal influences, psychological factors such as thinking patterns and coping styles, and social contexts including gender expectations and life stressors. By acknowledging this complexity, contemporary treatment can avoid the reductionism that characterized many historical approaches. Trauma-informed care represents another significant advance in treating women's anxiety. Throughout most of history, the relationship between traumatic experiences and anxiety symptoms was poorly understood. Women who developed anxiety following abuse or other traumatic events were often diagnosed with hysteria or similar conditions that failed to recognize the rational basis of their emotional responses. Contemporary approaches increasingly recognize how common trauma is in women's lives and how anxiety can represent an understandable adaptation to threatening experiences. As you continue to rest comfortably, perhaps noticing the weight of your body against the surface supporting you, let's explore some of the most promising current approaches to women's anxiety, those that integrate the best of modern understanding while avoiding the pitfalls of historical treatments. Mindfulness-based interventions have gained substantial empirical support for treating anxiety disorders. These approaches, which teach awareness of present moment experience without judgment, help women relate differently to anxious thoughts and sensations rather than being caught in cycles of fear and avoidance. Unlike historical treatments that often sought to suppress or control women's emotions, mindfulness fosters acceptance and gentle curiosity toward emotional experiences. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, has emerged as one of the most evidence-supported treatments for anxiety disorders. This approach helps individuals identify and modify thought patterns that contribute to anxiety while gradually facing feared situations in a supported way. Modern CBT protocols can be tailored to women's specific experiences and concerns, addressing issues like perfectionism, caretaking burden, or safety fears that may disproportionately affect women due to socialization and social realities. Body-centered therapies recognize the physical manifestations of anxiety and trauma, working with somatic experiences rather than treating the body as separate from the mind. These approaches, including somatic experiencing and sensory motor psychotherapy, help women develop greater awareness of and comfort with bodily sensations associated with anxiety. Unlike historical physical treatments that were often invasive or controlling, these methods emphasize the woman's own agency in working with bodily experiences. Group-based interventions offer powerful opportunities for women to share experiences, reduce isolation, and develop new coping strategies together. Women's therapy groups specifically addressing anxiety can help participants recognize how gender-related experiences contribute to their distress while building supportive connections. This social dimension of healing represents a significant advance over historical treatments that often isolated women or pathologized their social connections. Culturally responsive approaches recognize how women's experiences of anxiety vary across cultural contexts and how effective treatment must respect diverse understandings of mental health. Rather than imposing Western medical models on all women, these approaches engage with cultural frameworks for understanding emotional distress and healing. This represents significant progress from the colonial aspects of historical psychiatry, which often devalued non-Western healing traditions. Integrative approaches that combine multiple treatment modalities based on individual needs represent perhaps the most significant advance beyond historical treatments. Rather than prescribing standardized interventions based primarily on social class or preconceived notions about women's nature, contemporary clinicians can draw from a range of evidence-based options, including psychotherapy, medication, complementary approaches, lifestyle modifications, and social interventions. As the night deepens and perhaps sleep begins to feel closer, let's consider what the strange history of women's anxiety treatments can teach us about moving forward. One crucial lesson is the importance of listening to women's own accounts of their experiences rather than imposing external frameworks of interpretation. Throughout history, women's descriptions of their distress were often distorted to fit prevailing medical theories or social expectations. Contemporary approaches ideally begin with careful attention to how women themselves understand their anxiety, respecting their expertise about their own lives. Another vital lesson concerns the relationship between individual treatment and social change. Historical approaches often sought to help women adapt to restrictive or harmful social conditions rather than questioning those conditions themselves. Contemporary approaches increasingly recognize that truly addressing women's anxiety requires both supporting individual women and working towards social structures that promote well-being for people of all genders. This might include addressing issues like workplace discrimination, family leave policies, protection from gender-based violence, and access to comprehensive health care. The history of women's anxiety treatments also reminds us to maintain critical awareness about current practices. Just as past treatments reflected the biases and limitations of their eras, our own approaches inevitably contain blind spots and assumptions that future generations may find problematic. This recognition encourages humility and openness to continuing evolution in how we understand and address women's mental health. For individual women experiencing anxiety today, this historical perspective might offer both caution and reassurance. The caution involves remaining appropriately selective about treatment, seeking providers who listen respectfully and offer approaches based on current evidence rather than outdated assumptions about women's nature. The reassurance comes from recognizing how much progress has been made. Today's treatments, while still imperfect, offer far more effective and humane options than those available to previous generations. As your consciousness perhaps grows increasingly tranquil, drifting toward the borders of sleep, consider how the long and winding journey of women's anxiety treatments reflects broader human themes of suffering and healing, misunderstanding and insight, control and liberation. Throughout history, despite all the misguided theories and harmful interventions, we also see the persistent human desire to alleviate suffering and restore well-being, a desire that continues to motivate the search for better approaches today. The women who experienced these historical treatments, from Egyptian priestesses inhaling fumigations to Victorian ladies enduring rest cures to mid-century housewives prescribed mothers' little helpers, were not merely passive victims of medical practice. They were human beings navigating complex circumstances with the resources available to them, sometimes finding relief even from treatments we now consider misguided, sometimes resisting or reinterpreting these interventions based on their own wisdom and experience. Similarly, the physicians and healers who administered these treatments were working within the understanding of their times. While we can critically evaluate their approaches, we can also recognize that most were genuinely attempting to alleviate suffering rather than cause harm. This compassionate perspective doesn't excuse the damage caused by misguided treatments, but helps us understand how well-intentioned efforts can go astray when based on limited or biased understanding. As we conclude this historical journey, perhaps you're feeling the comfortable heaviness that precedes sleep. The story of women's anxiety treatments continues to unfold, with new chapters being written by researchers, clinicians, and women themselves who contribute to evolving understanding. The bizarre treatments of the past have largely given way to more effective, evidence-based, and humane approaches, though the work of creating truly responsive and equitable mental health care continues. What remains constant across time is the universal human experience of anxiety itself, those feelings of fear, worry, and physiological arousal that have been part of human experience throughout history. While the interpretations and treatments have changed dramatically, the underlying experience creates a thread of connection between women across centuries and cultures. In recognizing this shared humanity, we find both perspective on our own experiences and motivation to continue improving how we understand and address this most common of human emotional challenges. As sleep perhaps begins to envelop you now, carry with you this rich historical tapestry, not as a source of concern, but as a reminder of human resilience and the ongoing journey toward greater understanding. The strange and sometimes troubling treatments of the past have given way to more effective approaches of the present, which will themselves evolve into the more sophisticated methods of the future. In this continuing evolution of healing practices, we participate in humanity's enduring effort to ease suffering and find balance amid life's inevitable uncertainties. Rest peacefully now, knowing that while our understanding of anxiety continues to evolve, the fundamental human capacity for healing and growth remains constant across time. From ancient Egyptian fumigations to modern mindfulness practices, from spinning chairs to cognitive behavioral therapy, the methods change, but the essential human journey toward well-being continues. Sleep well, carrying these historical threads lightly in your consciousness as you drift into restful dreams. In our exploration of the strange history of women's anxiety treatments, we've traveled from ancient Egypt to Victorian England, from imperial China to modern America. We've encountered treatments ranging from the bizarre to the brutal, from the surprisingly insightful to the shockingly misguided. Through it all, we've seen how theories about women's minds and bodies reflected broader cultural assumptions about gender, emotion, and social roles. The history reveals not just how anxiety has been treated, but how women's emotional experiences have been interpreted and controlled through medical and social practices. It shows how anxiety itself has often been seen as particularly feminine, a sign of the supposed emotional excesses or constitutional weaknesses attributed to women throughout much of history. Yet it also reveals women's remarkable resilience in the face of both anxiety itself and often harmful treatment approaches. As our journey concludes and you settle into the peaceful embrace of approaching sleep, perhaps there's comfort in recognizing that despite all the misunderstandings and missteps of history, human knowledge does gradually advance. Today's understanding of anxiety as a complex interaction of biological predispositions, psychological processes, and social contexts offers more promising pathways to healing than the wandering womb theories or rest cures of earlier eras. May this historical perspective bring not just fascinating knowledge but also appreciation for the advances that make current approaches to anxiety more effective and humane. And may it perhaps contribute in some small way to peaceful sleep and calm reflection on the ongoing human journey toward understanding and healing the anxious mind.